Now let's get on to our program. I've always thought of Tevi Troy as a healthcare policy expert, and he is, but because that's the way that we've always intersected with Tevi and his work over the years in policy here at IPI. But Tevi is also a presidential historian, and we found out in our little pre-show chat that he's a historian first and a healthcare policy expert second. So he's in a very unique position of not only being a historian of the presidency in the White House, but also having worked in the White House and in presidential administration. So he's got not only his academic and research perspective, but he's also got his personal career experience, actually having probably witnessed a few fights in his time in presidential administrations. Tevi has written, is it 4 books on the presidency?
That is correct.
4 books on the presidency. He has an MA and a PhD in American civilization from UT Austin.
How come?
Yes, well, okay. No, don't get Addie in a bad mood. During the presidential debate last fall, Tevi did a podcast with Jonah Goldberg on Jonah's The Remnant podcast about the history of presidential debates. And it was just one of the most fascinating presentations and discussions I've ever heard. I shared it with Addie and some other people, and they really, really enjoyed it. And so at that point, I thought, we have got to do something with Tevi when we have a chance to do so. And so Tevi, we're really delighted that we've been able to schedule this with you today. We would love to bring you back to Texas sometime soon when we're allowed to do in-person events again. But at least we have the opportunity through Zoom to continue to do programs for our audience and bring in a variety of topics and authors. And we're really excited about our discussion with you today. So let me just tell our folks, Tevi has stories. He has stories, whatever the topic, whether it's presidential debates or whether it's the topic of his current book about conflicts and clashes in presidential administrations. He's just got great, great stories. And so if you haven't read the book yet, you should get the book. You should read it. You should read all of his books. He's got a great writing style, and he's just got the most amazing, wonderful stories. So with that, Tevi, let me turn this over to you. We'd love to hear some of your stories, and we'd love to hear about your book, and then I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tom, and to Meryl and to Addie for all this. This whole conversation that we're having right now, it started out of a little fight. I posted something on Twitter, something I thought was innocuous, and Tom criticized me on Twitter. And instead of fighting with him and saying, "Oh my gosh,
it's unbelievable that I would ever disagree with anybody on Twitter."
But my attitude on all this stuff is, we all live in the same country. We might have different political beliefs, but there are ways that we can get along. And so I reached out to Tom privately, and I said, here's what you said. Here's why I disagree. And out of that conversation came this book talk. So I appreciate that. It is also very 21st century, because you said you guys were aware of me via a podcast, and then I interacted you via Twitter, and now we're doing this book talk on Zoom. So I think it's all great. And then he also mentioned that Addie had particularly loved my conversation with Jonah. So I appreciate all the good work that Addie did. And Meryl, I've been reading your stuff for years. So I think this is just a great opportunity. And before I talk a little bit about Fight House, I do want to mention something that Walter Mondale has just died. And, I figure most people on this call are leaning right, as am I. And, in 1984, when Mondale was running against Reagan, he seemed like the absolute extreme of liberalism. God save this country from that left-wing threat. And now when I look back at Walter Mondale with these 30, 40 years in the background, I kind of wish today's Democratic Party was filled with Walter Mondales, because compared to what we have today, Walter Mondale, he was a statesman, he was politically astute. He welcomed into the White House a group of, I call nascent neoconservatives, people like Elliott Abrams, my mentor Ben Wattenberg, Gene Kirkpatrick, who were concerned about the foreign policy of the Carter administration, with good reason. Let me just say, they were very concerned about it. And Mondale invited them to the White House. He had a meeting with them in the cabinet room. He actually charmed them. Elliott Abrams recalls in his oral history how charming Mondale was. And he said, come home, don't support that actor from Hollywood. We're your real home. And he said that Mondale had them eating out of his hand, but then something bad happened. Carter walked into the room, and Carter completely alienated the group. And that Abrams later recounted of everybody in the room, the only people who he thought voted for Carter were Mondale and Carter himself after Carter's horrific performance. So I would just want to give a little tribute to Walter Mondale. And then you also mentioned debate. Walter Mondale became the Democratic nominee in 1984 in large part because he pushed back the Gary Hart challenge with his skillful use of that line, "Where's the beef?" He might have won it anyway because he had a lot of the kind of major domos on the Democratic Party on his side, but Hart was issuing a real challenge, and Mondale pushed back with that line. And then continuing on the debate, Ronald Reagan lost his first debate to Mondale quite badly in 1984, and people were talking about, oh my gosh, it's over for Reagan, and Mondale's going to win this thing. And but Reagan successfully pushed back with that famous line about how he's not going to exploit for political purposes the youth and inexperience of his opponent. And Mondale, again, to his credit, he laughed on stage, which is not something that you don't necessarily see opponents laughing at the other guy's bon mot. But he said he knew in that moment that he had lost the race. So he was politically savvy. He was an astute observer of the scene. Again, he's certainly to the left of you or me or probably most people on this, but he's somebody I admire. I've come to admire in American politics. And just one more quick Mondale story. He went to George McGovern, who famously lost another wipeout to Richard Nixon in 1972. And he asked McGovern, so, when do you get over the pain from this? And McGovern said, I'll let you know. Because McGovern also had not gotten over the pain of a pretty embarrassing loss in '72. So anyway, that's my my brief tribute to Mondale, and also to an era when people from the opposing parties could be friends, and I think that's where we should be today. What I talk about in my book Fight House is people who are on the same side who hate each other, because I don't think it's really interesting to write a book about, Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi don't like each other. Well, they're in different parties, and I don't expect them to like each other. But people within the same White House who are supposedly on the same team, who are working for the same president, those people at each other's throats, that really interested me. And so I wrote this book, Fight House, that looked at every presidential administration from Truman all the way up to Trump. And the reason I start with Truman is because Truman was the first president to enter with a White House staff as we know it today. There really was no White House staff in earlier years. Even when you talk about someone like Franklin Roosevelt, had the famous Brains Trust, people like Moley and Tugwell. Those guys who were university professors who came to, mostly from Columbia, came to work in the Roosevelt administration. They didn't work in the White House. They worked at agriculture or Treasury or State Department. And it was only in the middle of the Roosevelt administration, when there was a commission called the Brownlow Commission. The Brownlow Commission determined famously a four-word conclusion: the president needs help. And it laid out this structure for a White House staff. And the White House staff then started to develop under Roosevelt, but then Truman comes in after Roosevelt's death in 44, and early 45. And then Truman becomes the first president to have a White House staff, and it has to deal with it. And the big tension that you have in a White House staff is you have somebody who's next to the president who's advising him on X, but then you also have these people in these cabinet departments who might be half a mile or a mile away, and they're advising the president on X too. And they think that they're the lead advisor on the issue, and the person in the White House thinks maybe they should be the lead advisor on the issue. And that this tension usually comes up in foreign policy between the national security advisor and the Secretary of State. And that's a recurring tension that I talk about in my book in Fight House. And in fact, there's a great story I tell in Fight House about the Eisenhower administration, where the Eisenhower had John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State. And he picked Harold Stassen, who was a former governor of Minnesota. We're talking a lot about Minnesota politicians today, but Harold Stassen is picked by Eisenhower to be the lead negotiator on disarmament with the Soviet Union. But he is given cabinet rank. So he sort of works under Dulles, but he also has cabinet rank, and he's the lead person on negotiations rather than the Secretary of State. And it sounds eerily like the situation we have at State Department today, where Anthony Blinken is the Secretary of State, but John Kerry former presidential candidate, former senator, former secretary of state. He's there. He's got cabinet rank, and he's the lead negotiator on climate change issues. And we have not yet read about open tensions between the two of them, but it won't surprise me if there are, because Lord knows there were tensions between Stassen and Foster Dulles, including some comical ones that I talk about in the book in Fight House, where Foster Dulles goes to a conference in Europe that Stassen is also at. And Foster Dulles kind of commandeers the car that's supposed to take Stassen around, and he rides around, I think it was London, in the car instead of Stassen. And at one point, he even deigns to let Stassen in the car, where he gives him a ride someplace in his own car, which I think is a great touch. And the other thing is that the New York Times, when it talked about Stassen's appointment, it called him the Secretary for Peace, which really, really tweaked Foster Dulles, who said, "What does that make me, the Secretary for War?" So it was an ugly arrangement, and it was Eisenhower's fault in that Eisenhower set this thing up where you would have two people who in some ways had the same responsibility, and they both have cabinet rank, and they're both in the same department, and they were kind of at each other's throats. And it didn't last that long, and Stassen, unsurprisingly, is the one who left, and Foster Dulles stayed throughout the whole Eisenhower administration. So it is often a process, a poor process, that sets up these fights. And another fight we saw in the 1960s was which would be of interest to Texas listeners out there, is between Lyndon Johnson, who's the vice president under John F. Kennedy, and John F. Kennedy's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who is the attorney general. And the vice president is a very august position, as you all know, and one of the two people who can't be fired in administration, which is basically the vice president and the first lady. But the vice president doesn't necessarily have any inherent power. And if the president chooses not to give him responsibilities, he basically presides over the Senate and goes to funerals. And Lyndon Johnson hated it. He gave up being Senate Majority Leader, which is an incredibly powerful position, even more powerful when someone like Lyndon Johnson wields it, to be vice president in an administration where the attorney general, who was the most senior advisor to Kennedy and the most influential advisor to Kennedy, hates it. He just hates Johnson. And in fact, I talk in Fight House about the first time the two of them met, how Johnson is in the Senate and Robert F. Kennedy is a Senate staffer. People don't like to talk about this, but he worked for Joe McCarthy, the anti-communist senator from Wisconsin. And Johnson comes across Kennedy and McCarthy and a couple of other aides at a lunch. And Johnson walks right up to them and starts shaking hands all around. But one person doesn't stand and shake hands with Johnson. And that one person is Robert F. Kennedy. Well, you don't get anything by Lyndon Johnson. He noticed. And he stands, all 6'3" of him, over Bobby Kennedy. He was kind of short. He was about 5'7". And he looms over Bobby Kennedy, kind of just staring him down until Kennedy sheepishly gets up and shakes Johnson's hand. So Johnson wins the encounter, but he gains an enemy for life, because as Joe Kennedy used to say, Bobby's my boy. When he hates you, you stay hated. And there's this interesting dynamic in the the Kennedy administration, that Robert F. Kennedy is on top. I mean, he is the most powerful guy. But then suddenly, in a flash, and that tragic day in Dallas in November of 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. And suddenly, Robert F. Kennedy's still attorney general, but he's attorney general for a president who hates him. And so Johnson, who's lower on the totem pole, suddenly goes above Kennedy on the totem pole. He's the president. And at the first cabinet meeting that Johnson has, Robert F. Kennedy comes late. And Johnson is convinced that it's because Kennedy was trying to show him up. But he probably was. And we don't know for sure. Kennedy never spoke about it. But Johnson and Kennedy then have an encounter in the Oval Office after this meeting. And it's not a pleasant encounter. And they don't speak again for 2 months. Now, look, there's lots of people I go 2 months without speaking to, right? I mean, pandemic, you go a year without talking to your friends. But this is the sitting attorney general not talking to the president for 2 entire months. It's a very strange situation. And eventually, Kennedy does leave the administration, and he runs for Senate, where he torments Johnson. And Johnson, on Vietnam, is constantly looking at Kennedy, thinking Kennedy is going to be to his right, and that if he goes lighter on Vietnam, if he pulls troops out, if he backs off on Vietnam, Kennedy will be criticizing him from the right. But instead, what happens is as Johnson keeps pushing on Vietnam and sending more troops, Kennedy becomes this attacker on the left and torments him from the left, which really drives Johnson crazy. And eventually Johnson decides not to run for re-election. Kennedy jumps into the race and seems like he would have likely been the Democratic nominee until he too is tragically assassinated in June in California. So these fights can have real implications on what happens in national policy, where our politics goes. In the Nixon administration, which comes next, you had some titanic fights between Henry Kissinger, who is the national security advisor, and William Rogers, who is the Secretary of State. Now, William Rogers, he's probably not that well known today, but he was a big deal. He was Attorney General under Eisenhower. He was friends with Nixon because they both served in the Eisenhower administration. Nixon was vice president. He had a successful law practice in the 1960s, and whenever Nixon came to Washington, he was living in New York at the time, when Nixon came to Washington, Rogers would give him an office and a place with a phone, which, in those pre-cell phone days, that was a big deal. That was a nice favor. And so Rogers enters the administration thinking he's going to be the number one guy on foreign policy. And Kissinger is this upstart. He is this younger Harvard professor, worked for Nelson Rockefeller, not seen as favored by the Nixon folks. He's got this heavy Germanic accent 20 years after we fought a second horrific war against Germany. He's Jewish and is self-conscious about that. In fact, at one point, Nixon made it pretty clear that he didn't want Kissinger weighing in on policy matters having to do with the Middle East because of Kissinger's Jewish roots. And at one point in a national security meeting, Kissinger does make a point about Israel. And Nixon says, "Can we have the American point of view now, Henry?" Which is just a devastating line. And so Kissinger seems to have all the disadvantages, but he's got one advantage, which is he's really smart and he's relentless. And he fights against Rogers. He's constantly leaking against Rogers. He's undercutting Rogers. With the famous trip to China, Kissinger prepares 3 sets of briefing books for people who know about the outreach to China, who know about the outreach to China but don't know the actual details of when he's going to go, and then for people who don't know at all. And Rogers is kept in the dark throughout this. And in fact, there's one trip to India and Pakistan, an administration trip to India and Pakistan, where Kissinger doesn't show up at a meeting claiming he has a stomachache. And one of Rogers' aides says, "I bet you Henry doesn't really have a stomachache. He doesn't have a deli belly," he says. But he probably snuck off to China to set up an overture to China. And Rogers turns white because he recognizes that that's exactly what Kissinger has done. He does claim to have a stomachache, but instead ran off to China to set up the meeting. And in the famous meeting with Chairman Mao, Rogers, who's the Secretary of State, doesn't get invited. And even Kissinger, in his own memoir, acknowledges that he felt a little bad about that, a little bad. But Kissinger's tactics against Rogers, were really underhanded. So at one point, Kissinger is dating Jill St. John, who's a Bond actress, very attractive woman.
Yeah, and by the way, I just want to point out that was the strangest pairing ever in the history of ever.
Well, Kissinger used to say that power is the greatest aphrodisiac,
Yep.
which is how he would date all these attractive women. But so Kissinger's dating Jill St. John, and it shows up in the papers. And Kissinger, irate, goes to Nixon and blames Rogers for leaking this information to the press. But of course, Rogers didn't leak it to the press. Kissinger did. And he did it for 2 reasons. Number one is, well, he's dating Jill St. John. He wants people to know. But the second reason is that Nixon hated leaks. And if Nixon would think that Rogers is a leaker, then it would hurt Rogers in this interplay between Kissinger and Rogers, in the fights between them. And so Kissinger constantly was trying to portray the State Department and Rogers himself as big leakers. And we know that Nixon was so obsessed with leaking because he sets up a unit called the Plumbers. The Plumbers were designed to stop leaks. They also ended up stopping the Nixon administration because it was their actions that at the Watergate Hotel that in terms of the burglary that led to the undoing of the Nixon administration. So again, these kinds of actions and interactions, and Nixon being obsessed with leaks and Kissinger highlighting the possibility of leaks, it leads to behavior that maybe Nixon might not have engaged in. So this whole sense that these fights, these infights between people on the same team, they may sound petty and some of them are funny, and I appreciate you guys laughing at some of them, but the fact is they have real implications. They have national importance. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get at in the book Fight House. Now, obviously, I started the book in part as a result of all the attention paid in 2017, early 2017, to the infighting in the Trump White House. And Lord knows there was infighting in the Trump White House. But what I wanted to examine as a presidential historian is, well, was there infighting previously? Did previous administrations have infighting? Was what was going on in Trump unprecedented, as everyone was saying at the time, or was there something behind it? And Peter Robinson, who you guys probably know, former Reagan speechwriter, he had this quote that I heard him say in 2017, where he was talking about the Reagan administration. He said, of course there was infighting in the Reagan administration. We just didn't have Twitter, tweeter, twatter talking about it. And so part of what's going on is there's always infighting in administrations, and presidents can do some things to control it, and I do talk about those things in the book. But part of what's going on is when the media wants to focus on infighting, and when you have a 24-hour news cycle, and when you have a Twitter sphere that's reporting every story, and when I say reporting, I put it in scare quotes because some stories are not really reported, they're rumored, and then they appear out on Twitter, and it's as if they happened. And so the media is a part of this story as well. And of course, they play into it as well via the leaks, because so many of the ways that people get at their opponents inside administration are via leak and via the press and by getting stuff out there. Because with two rare exceptions in the book, there's very little physical confrontation. I'll tell you one of the funny physical confrontations is Al Haig, who was the chief of staff in late Nixon and then early Ford. He did not like a guy named Bob Hartman. And there was good reason to dislike Hartman, because Hartman was a bad actor internally and he leaked a lot and he was always getting involved in fights. But Al Haig sees an aide to Hartman in the West Wing and grabs the aide, not Hartman himself, but the aide to Hartman by the collar. And he says, listen, you tell that fat crowd, Hartman was of German descent and a little overweight, you tell that fat crowd if he doesn't cut it out, he's going to leave this place on a stretcher. So sometimes the stuff did get physical, but for the most part, it doesn't. And what I saw, you kindly mentioned that I probably saw some infighting in the Bush days. Yeah, I did. But you know what? The people who I was reading in the newspapers were fighting each other and hating each other. When you're in a meeting with them, they all were perfectly pleasant. And that's the interesting thing about this. You have to be, for the most part, pleasant to one another, even if you dislike each other, even if you have different agendas, even if you're leaking against one another. And in fact, there was a great moment I had in the Bush administration. I was privileged to sit in on cabinet meetings, and everybody heard about all the fighting between Rumsfeld and Powell, between Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, and Colin Powell, the Secretary of State in the Bush administration. And they're fighting, they hate each other, their aides are fighting, Armitage is leaking, and all this stuff is going on. And they have a cabinet meeting, and in a cabinet meeting, the Secretary of State sits on one side of the president, and the Secretary of Defense sits on the other. The Vice President's across the table. So those three people in that triangle were all fighting, because Cheney was also part of the national security wars in the Bush administration. And so Bush at one point makes some statement, and he looks at both Powell and Rumsfeld for agreement, and they both agree with the statement. And Bush says, now who says these guys can't get along? So Bush was quite conscious of all the stories in the press about the two of them fighting. Doesn't mean he could control it, but he certainly could make a joke about it. And again, you'd never see these guys take a swing at each other or kick each other or shoot spitballs at each other. This, for the most part, this stuff isn't physical. It's all taking place in subterfuge and meeting assignments, and who's invited to meetings, and who gets on certain lists, and who gets leaked about in the press. But it's fascinating stuff, and as I said a couple of times, it has implications. You guys kindly gave me about 25 minutes to speak, which I have now used. I'm happy to take any questions out there, and I just hope that Larry Haas, who out there is listening and demanded that I be interesting, I hope I satisfied his needs.
Well, if he is at all a reasonable human being, you have. It's interesting. Several of your examples involved this, like the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State being in conflict. It's almost like it's a structural problem, isn't it? That it's almost like it's designed for conflict. And I wonder, when you look at the way administrations are arranged, are there several such sort of relationships and offices that are just like they're designed for conflict?
Yes. So number one is the one you mentioned. The Office of the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor are always fighting. That's always a problem. Another possible one is the Vice President's office and the President's staff, especially if the Vice President is looking to run for office down the road. They might have different interests. So, for example, in the late Clinton administration, Al Gore wants to run for president. He's really mad at Clinton because he thinks the whole Monica Lewinsky thing messed him up. Whereas Clinton is really mad at Gore because Clinton feels that if Gore would embrace Clinton and embrace Clinton's policies, he, in the 90s were a time of peace and prosperity, that he will win that election. And so the two of them and their staffs were fighting with each other. So that's another one. One thing that doesn't get a lot of attention, I don't talk about this as much in the book, but is in the area of personnel. You have these White House liaisons who are basically, they're called White House liaisons, but they're basically the cabinet secretary's officer who's in charge of personnel decisions at the agencies. And then you have the Office of Presidential Personnel, and the Office of Presidential Personnel is supposed to make the decisions for who gets these jobs, both at the agencies. And so you often have tension there. So I think those are some of the main points of conflict. I don't really know what to do about the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State thing, even in the Carter administration, where you've got Zbig Brzezinski and Cyrus Vance were both in that administration. Vance is the Secretary of State. Brzezinski is the National Security Advisor. They have dinner together the night of Carter's election in 1976. Is in a Manhattan apartment of a mutual friend. They leave the apartment together. They walk together after the election, knowing that Carter has won this election, and they talk about the prospect of them working together. So they really start out in this kind of positive way. But then on the first day of the Carter administration, Brzezinski is shown his communications console, how he's supposed to communicate and get out there. And he has two phones on his desk. One rings from the president, and the other rings from the Secretary of State. They're kind of like these drop lines, they're called. And Brzezinski points to the second one, and he says, yank it out, yank it out. I work for the president, not for Vance. So again, here's a guy who you think is going to be friendly with the other guy. They know each other from before. They talked about working together, but on day one, he's already starting stuff. So I really don't know how to solve that one, other than you've got to, as the president, you've got to make it clear to the National Security Advisor that their job is to sort out competing interests, not to be a specific player. And it's very hard to get a National Security Advisor who wants to go along with that.
You mentioned the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and I always thought that, Clinton basically pushed Gore out and got Gore to lie for him, as he did many members of his administration. And I always thought that if Al Gore had resigned, in principle, because the president betrayed the country and, lied to me and had me lying on his behalf, that Gore would have been a shoo-in for election as president at that point. What a tough road for him to try to navigate in that situation.
Yeah, it's a good point, Tom. But there's another side of this, which is in my book, I talk about all the infighting that happens in the first Clinton term from 92, 96, before we know about Lewinsky. In the second term, there's a lot less infighting in the Clinton administration. And it's interesting because it's more scandal ridden and it's more stressful and it's more problematic. But I found less evidence of infighting. And the reason is what I call in the book the circle the wagons effect. They had a common enemy. And I have this great quote in the book from Ann Wexler, who is Barney Frank's sister. She was a Democratic operative. She was an aide in the Clinton White House. And she said, of course, as a feminist, she was offended by the Lewinsky stuff. But what do you want me to do? Side with Henry Hyde, Newt Gingrich? You want me to side with them? So in her Manichaean worldview, Clinton's behavior didn't matter. All that mattered was defeating the Republicans and circling the wagons and being on the same team. And even a guy like Sidney Blumenthal, who was a poisonous influence in life, but also in the Clinton White House, people were always kind of mocking him and undercutting him in the Clinton White House, except in the impeachment saga. Suddenly, all his skills are there because he's up against he's for using all these dark arts against the Republicans, and suddenly everybody's on board because hey, they hate the Republicans. The Republicans are trying to get rid of Clinton, and let's join together at the hip and be on the same team. So sometimes external strife leads to less internal strife.
I've always thought the most. Sort of I'm sorry. Go ahead, Addie.
Kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of. I mean,
not sort of like it, it's exactly it. Yeah, that's a good point. That's what it is.
Yep. Tevi, I've always thought the most awkward structural thing in a presidential administration is the attorney general. it's so strange that the president appoints the attorney general, but yet the attorney general is often tasked with, enforcing the law against the administration or whatever. So it just strikes me, just from a constitutional and from an accountability standpoint, that's the strangest structural thing in the executive branch. But are there a lot of historical conflicts between attorneys general and presidents?
Yeah, I've got a couple in there. And it's really interesting what you say, because in a way, there are three major lawyers in administration. There is the attorney general, who is the lawyer for the United States of America, if you will. You have the White House counsel, who is the lawyer for the office of the president of the United States. And then in some cases, especially with Trump and with Clinton, the president has a personal attorney who represents the interests of the person who is serving as president of the United States. And those people don't necessarily have the same views, and they don't have the same perspective, and they don't, they often are in different perspectives.
And they don't have the same fiduciary responsibility. They don't have the same obligation, right?
So I have a couple of interesting stories in that regard. So there was a guy named Nicholas, what's his name? Nicholas Larry will know the name. He was the attorney general under Johnson, Nicholas Katzenbach. And he at one point has here's the Washington Post has a story. And the story is detrimental to the Johnson administration. So he calls up the lawyer, the reporter who has the story, and he confirms that some aspects of it are true, but other aspects of it are not true. And he gets the reporter to write the story in a different way that is detrimental, but less detrimental. Well, the next day, LBJ calls up Katzenbach and he says, "I want you to fire whoever leaked that story to the Washington Post." And Johnson says, Katzenbach says, I can't do that, Mr. President. And nobody says, I can't do that to Johnson. Johnson's taking it back. He says, what do you mean? And he says, well, I leaked that story. I'd have to fire myself. And he explains why he did the story. And Johnson says, God damn, that's the first time I've ever gotten to the bottom of a leak in this town.
Okay, so I would have endless questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one more, and then I'll let other people play in the sandbox. How important is the chief of staff to preventing conflicts? And it's my understanding that presidents have not always had chiefs of staff, that's a somewhat new innovation, isn't it? So how important is chiefs of staff? How successful are they at managing conflict, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, the chief of staff is an important role, but the president is not. The president has, as you said, has not always had it. And the chief of staff can manage conflict if they see themselves in the role of managing conflict and not as one of the players, right? If the chief of staff sees themselves as one of the players, they get out there and they have their sharp elbows and they mix it up. So there was an interesting thing, and I talk about this in Fight House, that chief of staff really starts under Eisenhower. He brings it in as an innovation from the military, and his chief of staff, Sherman Adams, gets caught up in the so-called Vicuna coat scandal, and so he leaves because he accepted this gift, and so he's kind of humiliated because of that. Kennedy chooses not to have a chief of staff. He has the famous spokes on the wheel system where he can reach out to any of the staff members directly as direct interactions. And Johnson doesn't have a chief of staff, but he has a guy named Walter Jenkins, who's kind of his senior aide. When Nixon comes in, he brings in an actual chief of staff. H.R. Haldeman, relatively famous, went to jail under Watergate as a result of Watergate. And he's kind of an imperious chief of staff. And the next two administrations, which are the Ford administration and the Carter administration, react against Haldeman and to a bit Haig, whom I mentioned. And they say they're not going to have chief of staff. So what Ford does is, instead of a chief of staff, he has a staff coordinator, who's actually Donald Rumsfeld. Donald Rumsfeld was basically chief of staff, but they didn't want him to use the title. Whereas Carter takes it a step further, and he doesn't have a chief of staff at all, to the point where there's almost chaos in the early days of the Carter administration. In fact, on the first day, they don't know how, whether, or with whom to meet. And there's a guy who's a senior counsel to Carter, who's one of the older fellows, and he says, well, I guess I'll call a meeting to order. But he's not the senior aide. He's senior in terms of age, but not senior in terms of influence in the Carter. And so that he gets basically ignored. And so they look to Ham Jordan, who was the senior political aide in 76. And Jordan is not a logistics guy, not a management guy at all, and he doesn't want to deal with this kind of stuff. And he basically says, "We'll have a meeting when there's a need to have a meeting," which is a useless phrase, basically. And this guy Michael Siegel, who's a Democratic aide in the Carter White House, looks around at all the chaos that's ensues, and he says, "If only the KGB could see us now." So this back and forth without a chief of staff, I think, was problematic. And in 1980, Reagan brings in Jim Baker. We talked about him a little bit earlier. I still think I don't agree with him on everything politically, but I think he was the best and most effective chief of staff that we've ever seen. The criteria I set up for effective chief of staff are: you don't no scandal, so you don't get embarrassed like the Vicunus coat scandal, or the scandals that brought down John Sununu. Your administration has no scandal, meaning Iran-Contra or Lewinsky-gate or whatever it is. And the Reagan first term was pretty scandal-free. And then you bring your president successfully to re-election, which Baker did in 1984. So I would say that in that sense, he was perhaps the most successful. Andy Card, actually, under Bush, met those criteria, but kind of like a starting pitcher who stays in too long, he stayed into the second term, and things got a little worse from there. And I think Andy Card, whom I know and I admire and I like a great deal, you could tell by the end that he was just too tired. And I remember he got kind of ill at one point in the second term, and he just wasn't shaking it, and he hurt his arm, and he just looked like the job had aged him, and he finally leaves and Josh Bolton takes over. But for the most part, many chief of staffs are undone by one of those three things. And then sometimes you have chief of staff who, as I say, get into it a little bit too much with the staff. So John Sununu was chief of staff under George H.W. Bush. And he used to read the Washington Post in the morning, look for anonymous quotes that came from people in the administration, speculate on who those people were, even though you don't know, but he would speculate. And then he would go to the office of the person who he thought was the leaker and yell at them. So he kind of just got into it a little much and was involved in fighting with other aides. He and Darman Dick Darman was the OMB director, and they both were had very inflated sense of their themselves and of their intelligence. In fact, Sununu used to brag about his IQ score, whereas Darman used to brag about his SAT score. So that's how they told everybody how smart they were. And at the Bush administration, they would have these meetings in the Roosevelt room, which is a long oval table, and Sununu would be on one end of the table and Darwin would be at the other. And if anybody else said anything in the meeting, they would just yell at them and berate them. And they would go back and forth, humiliating them. And this process, if you ever went through it, was called being Darmanized. So, you guys run an entity, right? What's the implication if you have the two bosses yell at everybody who brings up any ideas? Nobody says anything. And so the Bush domestic policy shop certainly kind of ground to a halt. Not much came out of Bush domestic policy. And they would actually talk about where are the ideas. And Jim Pinkerton tried to bring up ideas. He got berated and humiliated by and threatened by Darman. And so it makes it really hard to come up with new, interesting policies when you have that kind of situation. Yeah. So again, the chief of staff can be a force for good, should be a force for good if you set it up right, but sometimes they get involved in the scrum a little too much.
All right. Well, I'm going to yield the floor to your fan, Addie Crimmins, and to see if Addie has any questions for you.
First of all, that's how you know you've made it, is when they've turned your name into like a threat. Like I hope to have that Darmanized like one day. One day.
I hope I never get criminalized, Addie.
I'm meaner than I look. So one thing I want to point out is, this is more of a comment than a question, but I'm fangirling here. There are so many great nicknames in this book that I haven't finished it, but I'm just enjoying I'm like making a list of all the nicknames. One of my favorite is Churchill, Dull, Duller, Dullest. That's fantastic. And then of course the colorful LBJ versus Kennedy. So just buy the book for the nicknames. I mean, it's fantastic.
Can I save you some work? You don't have to make a list, because in the appendix I list all the nicknames. Perfect.
And Tom kind of touched on this, but in reading, I kind of found three qualities that created the conflict: power, personality, and process is kind of how I've characterized them. And power, I'm going to gently submit, is indicative of how fragile the male ego is. It's like really has more power here. And personality is obvious, and process Tom kind of alluded to. And I think a lot of process came out of these personality clashes. I think, this worked, this didn't, who writes memos, who likes personal briefings, that kind of stuff. And of course they overlap, but what do you think there was a one that accounted more than the others, or how do you think we can, quantify how much of the conflict was attributed to each of those things?
Well, I have a similar three-part paradigm, I guess, in the book, where I talk about process as one of them. Second is ideology.
Yeah.
So the more ideologically aligned administration is, the less infighting you're going to have, and the less ideologically aligned, the more infighting. And then the third, and this kind of gets to personality, is presidential tolerance. If you have a president who says, I don't want to see any of this infighting, you're going to see less of it. I'm not going to say none, because you can't eliminate it, but you'll see less. Whereas if you're a president who, like Trump says, and this is a quote, I like conflict, well, you're going to see more of it. In fact, one of my favorite Trump stories is in 2016 on Trump Force One, before the election. They're on a campaign trip, and Trump is sitting there reading the New York Times. He says he doesn't read it, but he does. And he's flanked by two aides, AJ Delgado on one side and Hope Hicks on the other. So again, you talked about the male ego. Women get into it too, and it may be the male ego thing is only a thing because for the most part, for most of the story I tell, you only had male White House aides, and women only started to come into the White House in subsequent years. So Delgado and Hicks are flanking Trump, yelling at each other, screaming at each other. Trump, reading the newspaper, puts the newspaper down, shouts, "Cat fight," and lifts the paper back up again. Now there's a president who's willing to put up with conflict. So I think those three, and I don't really quantify saying one is 40, one is 20, one is 30, but or that wouldn't be enough, but 40, 20, 40 or anything like that. But what I do is I say those are the three main buckets in which I put it. And if you solve the ideology problem, you may have less of the other two problems. And if you solve the process problem, you can kind of work through the ideology problem. So I think they play on each other. I did just tell that quick Trump story, and I noticed that Ginny was disappointed that I haven't told enough Trump or Obama stories. And I have an Obama story that will kind of play to the point you made about the male ego. I argue that in the Obama administration, now Obama had this famous no drama Obama theory about him, and they claimed that there was no fighting because they all had the so-called no a-holes rule, and then everybody got along, which is not true. Okay, there was fighting in the right, but in the Obama White House, the divide, I argue, was along gender lines, because the women of the Obama White House kind of banded together, and they would have these private dinners with only the women were invited, and they had a theory, it's called amplification, where if a woman said something, another woman from the group, and they actually had a somewhat disgusting name for their group that I'm not going to say on this family call, but you can look at the book to find it. But the women from this group, they would have to amplify their friend, say, Susie said something. Yes, I agree with Susie. Susie's making a great point. So to some extent, the men felt a little put out by this. And there's one story I tell about this guy named Dan Pfeiffer, who thought he should have been communications director. He was actually communications director in the Obama campaign, and he loses out twice to a woman for the job when those women had not given as much to the campaign as he had and had not worked for the campaign. In fact, one of the women actually worked for Hillary and didn't end up working on the Obama campaign, but she was a woman, so they gave her the job because they thought there were too many white men in the administration at that point. Sounds a little like the numbers games that the Bidens are playing today, but it did lead to some conflict, and Pfeiffer was constantly undercutting his superior, and unsurprisingly, she didn't last that long. So yes, women can get into this stuff as well.
Anything else, Addie?
Not for now, but
okay. But you reserve the right. Okay. All right.
Amen.
That was wonderful.
Dr. Matthews, do you have a question?
I'll just ask a quick one here, Tevi. When Bill Clinton came to the office, as I recall, it was chaos for the first several months, to the point that you had the Surgeon General making some very unusual comments and other things. And he eventually, in May, if I recall it right, brought in David Gergen, who was a Republican, to sort of bring some order to the White House. So can you address and my recollection is sort of smoothed out a little bit after that, but can you address the issue of not just chief of staff or other, but actually going outside, Democrat going to a Republican to try to bring in a sort of a quasi position. He's not chief of staff or something, I don't think, to sort of get control of things.
Yeah, it's a great point. Sometimes they kind of do bring in the old veteran, I guess, not usually of the opposing party. But that Clinton thing is a really interesting one that you talk about. So 92, Clinton wins, and he decides to run the transition out of Little Rock, which was a mistake because Little Rock has only one airport and it's really small. And so reporters just camped out at the airport. You see Bob Rubin. Oh, Bob Rubin must be here to interview for Secretary of the Treasury. And anybody who goes through that airport is definitely going to be coming by for purposes of being interviewed, and so they were being written about in the paper. They couldn't keep anything secret. There was also the great line that Jim Carville had, which is a campaign is about screwing your enemies, but a transition is about screwing your friends. And they really took that to a whole new level in that Clinton transition. So there's all kinds of mess going on in that Clinton transition. It carries over to the Clinton administration, so much so that within a week of the administration, the New York Times is already writing about a failed presidency. And some of the Clinton say it's only been a week. I mean, how can you already call it a failed presidency? And so they do bring Gergen in. And it's not like Gergen was all Mr. Sweetness and light. In fact, Gergen may be the worst actor in the book in terms of the fights he caused across multiple administrations, in the Ford administration and in the Reagan administration. And he had some of those nasty nicknames attributed to him, Addy, in the Reagan administration, and then also in the Clinton administration. So Gergen is a multi-administration actor in terms of being involved in infighting, and he's getting into it with Stephanopoulos. He's leaking to the press a lot, but I think in part he got credit in that the Clinton administration kind of got its sea legs after a little while, because you learn how to do things. And so Gergen in historical memory is remembered as the guy who righted the ship, but he didn't really right the ship. He came in there as they were kind of figuring out what they were doing. And eventually he decamps for the State Department, and the whole White House is thrilled that he's gone, because at one point they Stephanopoulos estimated something like 25% of the negative stories about the Clinton foreign policy were coming from just David Gergen alone.
Mm.
So Gergen got into it, but it is true that sometimes the administration says, okay, we need a reset, we need to do things a little differently. And Stephanopoulos, actually, if you remember, he was the guy who's briefing the press on a day-to-day basis. He's pushed out of that job when Gergen comes in, and he becomes a counselor to the president and advising the president. And there's all this talk about Stephanopoulos getting demoted. And one of Stephanopoulos' friends, and I have the quote in the book, says, only in Washington would you have a situation where a guy goes from seeing the president in one meeting a day to being by his side the entire time, and that be seen as a demotion.
Folks, I told you he had stories, and he's got a lot more in the book, and I can't wait to dive into it myself. Let's get to some audience questions. Tevi, it's only been like 100 days for the Biden administration, but we haven't heard any stories yet of any conflicts or anything like that in the Biden administration. Do they really have their act together to this great of a degree, or have people just not started blabbing yet?
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think there's a couple of elements here. So first of all, in the early days of the Biden campaign, again, this is before he wins the nomination, there was definitely infighting. They couldn't agree on an agenda. There was fighting about whether to set up the offices in Wilmington, because there are some logistical challenges to doing it in Wilmington. Biden was known for screaming at his staff to the point where the staff didn't want to push back on him because they didn't want to get yelled at by him. And they never actually came out with a campaign agenda because there was so much infighting that they couldn't agree on it. But then you've got what happens in South Carolina, where Biden wins and he pretty much scares Bernie. Bernie having the possibility of getting the nomination scares everybody so much that they all kind of unite behind Biden. And then once Biden is clearly has the path to the nomination, the imperative among Democrats to beat Trump is so great that it kind of papers over every other issue. And so as a result, you had relatively little infighting in the Biden campaign once he becomes the presumptive and then the actual nominee. Well, now he's in the White House. There's definitely disagreements about certain things. And in fact, when Neera Tanden was selected to be OMB head, and she obviously didn't make it because of her many, 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 many nasty tweets. I mean, this wasn't just a couple of nasty tweets. And she also went after senators by name. And remember, senators are the people who vote on nominations, so maybe she should have thought of that beforehand. Tom and I got in this little minor Twitter spat, but I don't go after senators on Twitter. I mean, it's just not a smart thing to do. So, but in any event, so when that happens, there was some leaking into the press about Ron Klain, who's the chief of staff, about how Ron was behind the Neera Tanden pick, which again was a disaster. And there's one great quote in the Washington Post saying it was Ron, a whole bunch of Rons. And so, so I think when administrations have these kinds of challenges, sometimes you'll see stuff. But for the most part, I would say that we haven't seen a lot about infighting in the administration. And at this point, I also have to question the reporters a little bit. The reporters were thrilled to write about any story about infighting in the Trump administration. And again, there was fighting in the Trump administration. I'm not denying it in any way. But are they overlooking stories of infighting in the Biden administration? Or are they not seeking out those stories because they are more sympathetic to this administration? And in fact, there was this ridiculous article in the Washington Post last week about how there's no leaking in the Biden administration. And first of all, I just don't believe it. But second of all, the reporters are the ones who are responsible for getting the leaks. And maybe they're not doing their job to the same extent that they were trying to do it under Trump, because Lord knows they were getting plenty of leaks in the Trump administration. And some of it was coming from people voluntarily leaking information. But some of it is coming from reporters doing a good job of playing people off against each other. What's the famous Bob Woodward method? Is he gets a hold of a memo that makes someone look bad. He goes to see the person. He says, I have this memo that makes you look bad. Either you tell your side of the story to me, the reporter, so leak to me, or I will print it with you looking bad. And that's how Bob Woodward gets his leaks. And he's been doing it for 40 years. I mean, that's his method.
So it's kind of an own goal for a journalistic outlet to say nobody's leaking, huh?
Right. It's exactly. No, that's an excellent point on that. That's what they're doing. They're saying we can't find the leaks because maybe we're not trying as hard as we were over the last 4 years.
Your friend Larry Haas asked a question that you've pretty much already addressed. He was asking, to what extent are conflicts rooted in institutional conflict, and to what extent are they rooted in personality clashes? And like I said, I think
he had a second question. He said ignore that question. So if we want to, so okay. To what extent does internal conflict impede presidential accomplishment, and to what extent is it a sideshow that doesn't necessarily matter?
Whoa, that's getting to the heart of it there, Larry. Look, I wrote this book because I think it can impede presidential accomplishment. Now, obviously, I had an internal motto for the book when I was writing it. I had this note that I wrote to myself, which is the pettier, the better. Because I know that when the things are petty, that makes for better stories. But the whole idea of the book is that conflict matters, and conflict can have implications both politically and also from a policy perspective. And so that's what I'm trying to get at. Now, obviously, some of these stories, they're petty, and some of them may not matter. But I think in toto, what you see is when you have an administration that's riven by conflict, it is more likely to be unable to accomplish its goals. That doesn't mean it can't. Sometimes presidents use conflict to their advantage, like Clinton did in his first term when he set Dick Morris up against George Stephanopoulos, and he used the two against each other. And Stephanopoulos, who hated Morris, I mean, really, really hated him, made nasty jokes about him and was mocking him, and they would do stupid little tricks on Morris, like not tell him where meetings were taking place. But Stephanopoulos acknowledges in his own memoir, Alter Human, which is an excellent, one of the best White House memoirs, Stephanopoulos acknowledges in his own memoir that Clinton was just being Clinton, playing the two of them against each other to get better results. So sometimes the conflict can actually help, but for the most part, I think it's detrimental, and I think it harms administrations. And I think, and again, this is one of the theses of the book, is that it does have long-term historical implications and implications for a president's ability to accomplish stuff.
To what degree, I would think that the biggest source of disagreement would be about genuine disagreement about ideology and principles, but that's not the impression I get from this conversation, that it is more or less, power or personalities and that sort of thing, rather than actual solid disagreements about policy and ideology.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I papered over some of the ideological disagreements because there have been some serious ideological disagreements. I would say that the national security fights in the Bush administration, Bush W administration, the one for which I worked, were rooted in ideology. I mean, Rumsfeld had a different view of the world than Powell did. And it was interesting, Rumsfeld used to go to Powell and say, I read all this stuff about how you disagree with the Iraq policy and you disagree with our approach, but I'm in meetings with you all day and I never see you say anything. So Powell wouldn't confront Rumsfeld directly in the meetings, but he would have Armitage, his deputy secretary of state, leak to the press about how much he disagreed with stuff. And so it was his way of kind of remaining on the inside in the meetings, but being able to maintain his credibility with his journalistic friends on the outside. In the Reagan administration, the whole fight between Ed Meese, who is the counsel of the president, and James Baker, who's the chief of staff, that was rooted in ideology. I mean, Jim Baker was the kind of pragmatist deal maker in the Reagan administration, who had very good ties with the press. And Ed Meese was kind of the conservative conscience, the idea guy that Reagan brought with him from California, who was supposed to be Reagan's id, the real conservative guy there. And so a lot of that fight was rooted in ideology. So there are definitely ideological aspects to these disagreements. But again, you have to remember what I'm talking about in these books is people are on the same team. So if you, like George W. Bush, set up your domestic policy staff to be people who believe in compassionate conservatism, you're going to have less infighting on that issue, which is what George W. Bush had. In the Trump administration, you didn't really know what the ideology of the Trump administration was, right? You had the kind of traditional Republicans who were represented by Reince Priebus in the first year, I guess, or so. You had the kind of Bannonite blow it up types, and you had the so-called globalists, or the Gary Cohn types, whom Bannon dismissively referred to as the Democrats even. And Addie, you'll like this because you like the nickname thing. What I say in the book is that you have the same stuff, right? The same tactics are used, tried and true. People don't talk to each other, people undercut each other, people leak each other. It's all the same. But the one thing we saw in recent years is they use technology to kind of foster some of the things that they do. So you've always had nicknames, which Addie likes my many nicknames in the book. But in the Trump administration used to have emojis to symbolize people, which is obviously something you could have never done before. And Gary Cohn, who was derided as a globalist, if they wanted to refer to him in a text, they just used a picture of a globe, the globe emoji.
That's great.
And Reince Priebus was known as Prancer for I don't know what reason, but they had a little reindeer emoji for him.
That's fabulous. Justin Ryan has a question. And all I really have to do is say the name Don Regan. Seems like there was an awful lot of infighting in the Reagan White House surrounding Don Regan, and whether or not Don Regan actually tried to be too powerful or tried to have too many roles in the White House in Reagan's first term.
Yeah, so let me just correct the historical record a little bit here. So Don Regan was not in the White House in the first term. He was the Treasury Secretary in the first term. Okay. Jim Baker was the Chief of Staff. And Jim Baker leaked something to the press that irks Regan. And Regan calls up Jim Baker and chews him out using rather salty language. And they end up having an apology lunch together. And at this apology lunch, Regan and Baker come up with this idea of switching jobs. It's kind of unheard of, this staff trade. I say in the book it's the worst staff trade in history. But Regan had almost no private interaction with Reagan in the whole first term. He never had a one-on-one meeting with Reagan in the whole first term, even though he was Treasury Secretary. Baker was seen as a political operative, but he was desperate to be taken more seriously, to be seen as a cabinet official, a policymaker. And so they switched jobs, and it's terrible. It's a bad call. Baker is good as Treasury Secretary because he's good at everything, but Don Regan is a terrible Chief of Staff. He fights with Nancy Reagan. In fact, Nancy Reagan has this great line that Regan is good at this chief stuff, but he doesn't really get the of staff part, which I think is just wonderful. And when Iran-Contra blows up, Nancy Reagan feels that Regan is blaming Reagan a little too much and making Reagan do some of the cleanup and just doesn't the cleanup. It doesn't like how Regan is handling that part of things. And Then there is a new aide who's brought, his name is Kohler, who's brought in as communications director in the Reagan second term. And it turns out that this guy, in addition to an impressive background, had one thing on his resume that you wouldn't want, which was he was a little boy in Germany and he had joined the Hitler Youth. And so this shows up in the Washington Post, and this guy, he actually has the shortest staff tenure I've ever seen. He has 5 days, half a Scaramucci. And Reagan says that his name came from the East Wing, which is code for it came from the First Lady. And Ronald Reagan has it with Reagan at that. And that is what leads to Reagan being fired and his undoing. But Reagan gets his revenge because then it's never over in Washington because people just linger around. And Reagan writes a memoir where he is the one who spills the beans on Nancy Reagan's use of astrology in determining aspects of the Reagan schedule, which is something for which she's forever known and is impossible to shake. So so Reagan gets fired as a result of Nancy's manipulations, but he gets his revenge later.
All right. Well, let's talk about first ladies because you've brought up Nancy Reagan. We have several questions. We have a question about Larry Haas says he's reading Karen Tumulty's book on Nancy Reagan. So to what extent is White House conflict caused by First Lady and how she operates? And Jenny Webb asked about Hillary Clinton and some of the stories about how Hillary Clinton was sort of a tyrant to staff and to White House personnel and things like that. So you mentioned early in your discussion First Ladies, but then we never really talked a lot about sort of conflict caused by First Ladies or things like that. So probably the position of First Lady has more influence over administrations than we might think, huh?
Oh yeah, First Lady is definitely influential. Definitely some of them, not all of them, get involved in some of the conflicts. And it is interesting Larry's reading that book because there's also that new book out on Lady Bird Johnson that shows that she was more influential than we knew at the time. But for people who are really interested in this, I wrote a chapter in a book that came out this year in 2021 called Esther in America. And it talks about the First Lady kind of from that biblical Esther, the story of Esther and Haman and in Persia, from that perspective. And it talks about how Esther really had no power in the court of the Persian Emperor Ahasuerus, only the fact that she was married to him. And that's similar with the First Ladies. Their only power is that they're married to the president. I have a great story in the book about Jerry Ford's wife, Betty. She used to spout off on issues, including abortion, where her position was different than the rest of the administration and the rest of the Republican Party. And at one point, some of Ford's aides complain about this, and they tell Ford to basically shut her up. And Ford says, well, her office is right down the hall. You go tell her. So, there's a limit to what presidents can do to control their wives if they're not happy with what they're doing. But I would say that Nancy Reagan was probably the one most involved in some of the conflict. Hillary Clinton was a little bit as well. In fact, there's a great story in Stephanopoulos' book about how Bill Clinton used to come down in the morning and he was full of energy and he was always excited and happy and ebullient, and he'd be this great guy that everybody knows about and reads about, kind of a friendly, charismatic fella. And then he'd get a phone call and his mood would blacken and his face would darken and he'd start yelling at the staff how they don't do what they're supposed to and they're not protecting him and they're all horrible. And so a new aide once whispers to Stephanopoulos after one of these phone calls, which happened every day, said, what the heck is that phone call he gets every day? And Stephanopoulos says, oh yeah, that's from Hillary. So she definitely could darken the mood there with Bill. The First Ladies, I think have a role to play. Another interesting thing I talk about in that Esther in America chapter is sometimes there's fights between the First Ladies. So Barbara Bush and Nancy Reagan don't like each other at all, and Nancy Reagan is quite mean to Barbara Bush, and Barbara kind of in her waspy silence maintains a straight face throughout it while she's second lady. But when she's first lady, she at one point really gives it to Nancy, and they have a confrontation at one point and they never again speak. So there was some ugliness there.
Well, we're getting to the end of our time. There's one more question here. And this question is from Justin Ryan, and he is positing that the Reagan's second term was very thin on talent, and that it may be that that's part of why Reagan's second term was not as successful as his first. Do you agree with that?
It's actually a recurring phenomenon. The best known talent, I'm not always going to say the best talent, but the best known talent is in the first term. Right? The people from each administration tend to be the people who serve in the first couple of years. And sometimes, I had a friend who worked in the Obama administration, and he told me that he left sometime in the second term. And I said, "Why'd you leave?" And he said, "Because at one point, the people who were interns in the first term are now my peers in the second term." And so you do have that people, the first terms you bring in the top talent from the outside world, and by the second term you're promoting the guy who was promoted, who came in as some nobody on the in the Iowa campaign staff. So I think that is a recurring phenomenon. I think it's not just endemic to Reagan, but also presidents have trouble attracting talent when things aren't going well. The Trump administration often had trouble getting talent because a lot of the kind of standard Republicans didn't want to work there. I heard this especially in the Trump transition in 2016. A lot of people didn't think he had a chance, but B weren't happy with his demeanor and all that stuff. And so he had. I heard that they had trouble getting the top talent to that transition in 2016.
Yep. Well, Tevi, this has been terrific, and I'm sure everybody is going to want to read your book. And I appreciate you bringing up the book about Esther as well. That also sounds like a really interesting read. So, thanks so much for that. I want to remind folks that this event will be recorded. Thanks to Dr. Matthews reminding me to hit the record button at the beginning. So it will be recorded. It will be archived on our website and on our YouTube channel. So if you've enjoyed this discussion, you could share it with your friends, share it on social media, et cetera, et cetera. And Tevi, I thought that was terrific. You do a great job. You've got great stories, and we'd love to have you down here in Dallas sometime in person when we get back to being able to do that.
Okay, I'm double vax plus 2 weeks, so I'm ready to go.
There you go. Okay, all right. Well, most of us, I think, have at least one, so we're making good progress.
All right, well, everybody stay safe and buy a Fight House.
Thanks so much for joining us. We really enjoyed it. I'm sure our attendees enjoyed it. And with that, we'll sign off and wish everyone a good afternoon.